As strange as it may sound, one of the prevailing preoccupations of my interest in sports, in esports, as kind of a equivalent of that within the digital virtual world, has been not just the concept of the champion, the greatest player, the one who he excites you with his play, he amazes you, he illuminates what's even possible, he elucidates the mechanics of the game, the greatness, that's the finesse that's possible to show and manifest within the game. Yes, obviously that is the primary thing that draws and compels, I'm sure many people, but myself, to certain sports athletes or esports players, great teams, how they fit together. But beyond that, another thing that has always really fascinated me, and it's something that I've tried to kind of narrow down and I've identified and I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because it directly relates to the champion, is the concept of that guy who has the talent, he has the skills, the team that have the pieces, and they have what it takes, where when they play the semi-final, when they play the quarter-final, when they get into the normal matches, they seem like they could be the best. They could do it. But then they get into the pressure moment, whatever that may be for them. For some of them, that might just be a big game when it's offline and they were amazing online. For some, that might be the grand final of like the biggest tournament at GSL or international or Worlds or something. And then somehow they always seem to lose at that moment. So what's fascinating is with the other guy, the champion, sometimes he faces odds that seem insurmountable. Sometimes he faces a time where he's won so many times and people have looked at his style and they should have figured him out, and people know what he's going to do, and surely it won't work this time, but it does. Well, the same way, you go over to this other guy, this guy playing under pressure, but who has all the talent, and suddenly you see him wilt. Suddenly you see the amazing things he does. Where are they now? What's happening to them? And so this is a topic that transcends all of esports and pervades all esports. And it's something I want to talk about in depth because I've thought about it a lot, and I think there's a lot of tangential issues that we can bring up here. So if you want to talk about some examples of this, I mean, I'll go on different scales here. So a great example in Brood War would be the player Stork, because if you look at his record in semi-finals and his number of finals appearances and the eras he would continually get back to finals and the different opponents he could beat in a semi-final or a quarter-final, it really was no joke. He could beat every single player who he lost to in finals, in semi-finals and quarter-finals, because he did. And in Pro League matches, even big Pro League matches, he could beat these guys. He was as good. Or rather, he could summon the game on that day to be as good and beat them. And yet, on these big finals, it just didn't happen. And at times, yes, he was facing gods, but it also seemed like it almost didn't matter at some point. So some other examples would be Sue from StarCraft 2. It's a guy who made 4 GSL Code S finals in a row. That's unheard of, unparalleled. Before that, people had made 2. And we're talking about MVP, like greatest champion of all time, this sort of stuff. He made 4 and he won none of them. He lost to a different person every time. We talk about CLG in League of Legends. Now that might seem like a more extreme example, because yeah, the CLG we're thinking of now isn't a team that's like making the finals of LCS and all that sort of thing. But every season they'd had that period where they'd have the 2 or 3 games, or the 3 or 4 games, or the 4 or 5 game stretch where you'd think they've got it together now. They're looking good, like they'd look like they could close out games and they understood, but that would just disappear in playoffs. That would not even exist anymore. In Dota 2, a great example of this obviously is Cloud9, because listen, they looked like they had the right team. Not necessarily all the star players. They didn't have like Arteezy and these, but they had the team. They had the right synergy. They had the right pieces. They had some good strategical approaches. But when they got to those finals, we all know that it's like they would always find a way to choke it away, or to just give up some massive advantage that normally they'd be smarter about how they controlled it, or certain players would just completely disappear off the map. This just happened again and again. To give a CSGO example, I'd have to pick the player Device, because if you look in group stages or in like random quarterfinals, especially online play as well, I'm not exaggerating to people who've only seen the majors, you don't know Device. Like, this guy's talent level is utterly insane. He might be the best online player ever in CSGO. He's so dominant. He's so fucking good. He's complete in all aspects of the game. He can dominate in any area of the game versus any opponent. But you get him into that semi-final, and nobody truly knows why. I haven't talked to him in depth. I don't understand Danish. Something's happening to him mentally. Something's happening that he is the one who destroys himself, not the opponent. It's not the opponent battling him psychologically and taking him down, because it's different people each time. He's the one who destroys himself. He's the one who limits and hinders his own chance to succeed. So when you talk about these people, one of the things that I thought would help me phrase this debate in terms of how I'm thinking about the concept of how... Because by the way, I should probably mention this. When I say the champion who can do these things and the guy who does this and chokes, in many senses, yes, some of those champions are just exceptional people. Like I've met certain people, like I think of Cooler in his early days, Stefano. Some of these people do come with this natural kind of like you can't affect them mentally. They don't give a fuck what you think. And so to naturally have that, or to have developed naturally in that way, is a great boon to have. You're not going to be as self-critical or whatever, or think like, oh, this guy should be better than me. So that will help. You might naturally have a predilection to being capable of withstanding the pressure. But I know that some of those great champions who made themselves into great champions. A great example would be like Get Right in Counter-Strike. These are players where they do worry about things and they do have concerns and whatever, but they first of all, they prepared to the extent they wouldn't be worried anymore. They honed their skill set. They didn't give up. These are all key qualities. So what I'm essentially suggesting is sometimes this player or this team could have been at a point in their life, or might still be, where they could be in either group. They could go from the losers who always do that to over to the great champions who constantly win and they accomplish great things. I don't know whether they go vice versa, because if you figured it out, you tend not to go back. It's a kind of a mind state. So one of the things I was thinking of was this great Bob Marley quote that says, "Some people feel the rain, others just get wet." Now what's funny is, ignoring his interpretation of that and what he originally meant, the context back, because we don't have any, and it's not something I've looked into. What's funny is I actually saw that quote and it made me think of this topic, and I thought of it in probably a totally different way to how most people will think of this. So when I hear that quote, "Some people feel the rain, others just get wet," I thought of it in the sense of this, like feeling the pressure, like having all this stuff weighing down on you and you wilt. To me, that's like feeling the rain in the sense of like, oh, now it's raining, and it like depresses you, and you feel like, oh, I'm so cold and it's horrible, and like, oh, I wish this wasn't happening. I wish it was sunny. I wish it was a nice day. Like if everything was going right, like things would be going my way and stuff. Whereas that's like the mentality of the guy where everything just goes wrong for him. He chokes. It all goes terribly. He gets overwhelmed. Like, it's not normally like this. Like, this is so unfair. Like, oh, if only things were differently. To me, that can represent that, okay? And the other side of, like, others just get wet. That's like the champion's mentality. It doesn't matter what happens to the champion. It doesn't matter that he's facing the opponent who's supposed to beat him, who's beaten him before, who's got his number, who's got everything figured out about him, who's got more skill, who's been here before and won before. The great champion, there's something about them where they get into this mentality where it doesn't matter what your odds are to win and what their odds are to win. It doesn't matter all the metagame and all this context and if their mouse is slightly off that day and if they're feeling bad and they only got 4 hours sleep. The real champion somehow can lock into this mind state of like, none of that matters. All that matters is whatever I have with me today. Let's say say we have a percentage of ability and performance level that I can use today. Obviously, in an ideal world, it'd be 100, and that's what the guy who chokes often worries about, the fact that it's not, and he knows it's not, and he can't get to that. The champion, they've got something about them where if it's only at 80%, then they can somehow accept that and just play. And they'll just use the 80%, and because they won't hinder themselves with doubt and second guessing and wishing and just everything overwhelming them and their emotions overtaking them and looking too much at that and then trying to push them down and all this, because he won't do any of that, he can just play with his 80%, and that might be enough to win. He might find a way with that 80% somehow to win and to prevail, or maybe just to hang on, and then the opponent has a moment where he chokes. This is the champion's mentality, separated from what happens to the guy who chokes. This is kind of like the process of seeing the chokes and finding a way past them, or more importantly, this is my mentality, a way to live with them. And when you can live with them, then you can start to handle it in some way. The key thing is, some of these guys will never be the guy who naturally has that, or who's just naturally developed that way, who maybe is like a natural in the sense that it just works for him. He didn't have to develop it. It seemed to be the way he naturally went. Instead, we're talking about just fixing something. They're already great players. They're already in finals. Sometimes they're just losing finals narrowly. It might only be a tiny tweak they need to win. Who cares if they can fix it all and be this totally... All we're talking about is finding a little tweak to win. So let's look at this. First and foremost, you can't fight that feeling. You can't ignore it. You can't deny it. If you do all these things, it will always haunt you. It will be that thing, that dark thing that you that you push down. It'll be like the Jungian shadow, where it's gonna, if you push it down here and you ignore it and you say it doesn't exist, it's gonna express itself and find a way into your life. Maybe as what appears to be external forces or things that you aren't in control of. Instead, you have to acknowledge it. That's a key thing. Once you acknowledge it is there, that I'm having these problems arise in certain situations again and again, it's not luck, then you understand the concept that strikes with these guys. With these guys, they just never win. And the reason why is it is inevitable. For these sorts of people, that's the whole point. It's not that it's just luck and that this just happened once. It's that whenever these exceptional, talented people, get into this situation, this thing is happening again. So they have to understand, acknowledge it because it's inevitable. Be comfortable with it. Now that might sound like the most ridiculous glib statement, like, you're really you're choking your tits off there, aren't you? You're probably like thinking, what failure are you going to be? Who could even love you as a person? Like, if you can't even just win over this guy when you've lost to 17 other people before, like, just be comfortable with it, mate. Just understand that you're a fucking loser. Like, I'm not talking about that. That's obviously ridiculous. What I mean by that is, you have to learn to become comfortable with it. Not like you'll be comfortable immediately. You have to acclimatize yourself to it. You have to experience that moment enough times with an open mind to what it is, that eventually it's not that you're going to ever have a great time there, but eventually you'll just be able to deal with it. It'll be like being in the rain. Like, if you live in England, this is why it's the Bob Marley's great. If you live in England, it fucking rains all the time. Not every day, but it will rain regularly. It's going to happen. So if you somehow were someone who could only enjoy your life when it was sunny, well, you're in for a fucking bad life if you live in England, mate. But you know what? If you can get like I am, so if it rains, you go, okay, you put on a coat and you go out. You still do all the same things you do anyway. You get a little bit wet, and then you come in and take the coat off. You learn to live with it, and it's a bit cold. Okay, well, again, you've got a coat on. Oh, you're a bit wet. Oh, we'll use a towel when you come back in. There are ways around it. Listen, it's never going to be as awesome when it's sunshine and it's all lovely and the weather's nice and warm. But there's ways around these things. You have to learn to acclimatize yourself to them. That's the mark of a champion. Like I say, it's not necessarily that he plays his best when he's under pressure. Some of them do. I think those tend to be the naturally exceptional ones. It's not that you have to play your best. You just have to play well. Or maybe I should say it differently. There's a great phrase in like I think it's like epistemology or something. It's the concept of, in philosophy, the concept of it doesn't matter if something is true. It just matters if it is true enough. Because in a human sense, can we even access truth? Can we truly know that this one thing can be identified as pure in the sense that, or is it just true enough that it's something that works for now? It's something that we can accept as a premise to think about. In this sense, it doesn't matter that you have to play your perfect game, that everything has to go right. Because if you worry about that, and that's the concern, you're going to always be hindered in these big moments. What matters is it possible to play well enough to win? Is it possible to play well enough where you don't know that you can win, but hey, this guy might make a mistake. He might be fucking nervous as well. That's another thing people don't ever do. They don't ever understand these people. They're so obsessed with looking at themselves that sometimes you just have to stick in there, hang in there, don't worry about it. And this guy might make a mistake. He might be nervous. He might seem like a great player, right? Oh, he's destined to win. Maybe this is his first final. Maybe this is the final where, after looking so great, suddenly he collapses or he makes a key mistake and that just cripples him. But you have to hang in the game and give yourself an opportunity and wait and get to that point with some endurance and comfort with the problems of playing like this and not letting it overwhelm you, that then you have your chance. If you just break before him and completely concede and capitulate the whole victory, but mentally and maybe physically, before it even gets to that point, he'll never have to worry about that. He'll be like, oh, starting to bottle there, but that guy just fucking choked. Like, oh. And he'll look like the great champion. You have to realize that this moment, this is a key concept to understand. And these are things I'm not saying it because I've like studied the game, like, oh yeah, I can see what Roger Federer thinks when he plays that. I'm thinking this, like, I've studied these things and I looked at how they applied to my own life and things I thought of. So the key thing to understand here is this moment, the moment where you feel the pressure and you feel like everything's going to go wrong and nothing's perfect, and it makes you want to run away from it because it's so uncomfortable and it's so alien, it's so horrible. It's not like that nice group stage game where you can just play more freely and you know you're good and you can win this and who cares. Not. The reason why this is so key is because you have to understand is you have to reframe it in your mind so that it's no longer a negative to feel that pressure. And the reason why it's not negative, that's not a good statement again, is because it's not negative. Because this is the moment, the only moment that exists from which truly great things in your life can be accomplished. And what I mean by that is, that's why you feel this pressure. Because your brain knows, like, this is the moment I have to succeed, I have to do this now. And that tension, that holding on tightly like that, that's what's crippling these people. That's not when you're at best, you can play in a free manner. You can play where your mind isn't associating, like, it's famously called outcome independence. You can play in a manner where you're not worried about the outcome. You're just trying to perform the action to the best of your abilities, regardless of the situation, regardless of what someone will do to you and how it could go wrong. And that's where you're going to succeed. When you must win, you must. that's when you see it slipping away from you. Like my friend Nanawa, who's a StarCraft 2 player, often finished second and made a lot of top fours, and he very rarely ever won. And he used to say when it was at his worst, that when he would be in these winning moments, he'd be winning the game and it'd be against this big player and he's in the final and he knows it's all won, and all he has to do is just play out this last part of the game like normally. Suddenly his mouse would just start to move slower, and it would be like a horror scene. He couldn't control it. He'd just be looking at his body and his mouse, and he'd be losing control of the game. And he literally even said he felt like he had this electricity pulsing up and down his body, like paralyzing him, and he couldn't move, and he was going slower and slower, and the enemy was suddenly gaining and making him move, and he was throwing it, and he knew it was all going wrong. He knew this. How can this happen to me? This is my moment. I'm supposed to win now. But it was crippling him, and it was crushing him. There's a great Ned Stark quote from Game of Thrones. Eddard Stark, this very honourable character, I think is a really cool character. And he say his son, Bran, one of his youngest sons, says to him, "Can a man still be brave if he is afraid?" And there's a great line. This just sums up this whole issue. And the Ned Stark character says, that is the only time a man can be brave. So you know that guy who's just naturally somehow succeeds and all that sort of thing? We would think of him amazingly as the hero. He's so brave. How can he cut his courage? If he naturally doesn't feel this pressure, it's not as big a deal to him. That's not particularly brave. The guy I respect is the guy like a Sue, like a Stork, etc., who this seems to be the worst moment of their life when they get in these situations. You know what? Sometimes they win, sometimes they do, but and they keep putting themselves there. They're willing to face that and go, you know what? I failed last time. I looked like a fucking idiot. Like I didn't show my talent. People think the other opponents are all better than me, even though I have more talent. And I should have been a great player. But despite all of that, I'm going to keep facing this. I'm going to try and fight my way through this. I'm going to try and succeed in this way. In sports, you can talk about LeBron James when he choked and he had those problems. But you know what? He got over it in the sense that he became a champion. He became comfortable in that moment where he accepted it. That's the thing about the fact that this is the moment from which great things are accomplished. This moment is necessary. It is necessary. For these people, they will never get this chance to accomplish and achieve great things because of how they're affected by it, unless they're in this situation. So if they know that, and they know that it's about bravery, and it's about accepting and not fighting it and becoming comfortable with it, then they'll understand this concept that, like, I can't just worry and think I can get past it and it won't really affect me. There's something I have to address. And I'll give you a quick example from my own life, because I had the same thing happen to my own career. When I used to do it, a lot of people won't know this. When I first started out, my own medium was writing. Now, I wasn't a very good writer, but I put in a lot of effort there, and I learned how to do it. Written interviews, had a lot of time and freedom, and you weren't pushed by the interview. You could just sit there at home and he was in his home. Then I started to do articles, and I could think of my thoughts, and I could think over them and go, could I have expressed myself differently? Like, read other things from other people, like, I'm trying to pick things up here. But when I started to do interviews, back then it wasn't video interviews, it was text interviews. Audio interviews. We would just record them. But even so, an audio interview still has the same pressures in many senses as the video interview. So I would do these audio interviews, and here's what's going to be surprising to people who've seen me do interviews now, because they're going to think this doesn't make any sense. I used to do these audio interviews, and the average length of one at most would be 10 minutes. They were just from events. Okay, I'd go to events, I'd meet the pro player, some of the same people I'd interviewed in text in massive, insane detail. I'd interview this guy. It's only at most going to last 10 minutes, so no big deal, right? You can talk for 10 minutes. I mean, look at this fucking video, like look at this whole channel I've got. So I'd start talking to this guy, and if I got to a moment where I ran out of questions, like I hadn't thought up a great question, or in the moment, because when you're in the moment of interviews, etc., sometimes you'll just forget your question. Maybe he gives a cool answer and you ask something different, that throws you off. You forget what your question is. You forget what to say. And even worse, in forgetting and trying to get it back, you're trying so hard to get it back, you suddenly reach a moment where there's silence for what's actually 2 or 3 seconds, like you could feel the words and they're just disappearing. If that happened to me, I would instantly end the interview right then, because I felt like those seconds felt like they lasted like an hour, and I was thinking, oh shit, people are going to listen to this. It's like nothing going on, and I would just be like, thanks for your time, and I'd end the interview there, right? Even if, in the most extreme examples, it had been a minute and a half and I'd asked this guy 2 questions, I would sometimes do that. And what's funny is I had to come through all this process of realization that I acknowledge that I've got this problem. I had to learn to be comfortable with it. How did I do that? By forcing myself to do this over and over, to the extent that this became my everyday reality, to do these interviews like this. And eventually, as a result, I managed to learn to live with that by accepting that this is necessary. This is the moment from which I can do a really great interview. That's the key quality to understand here. I actually learned that the moment that you're worried like that is actually the moment where you can do your best interview. So here's the key concept. what I realized was, first of all, when you have that pause of a few seconds, because you're inside your own head thinking about it, and you feel the world in a different way when you're in that moment, it feels like it lasts a long time, right? I went back, and by acknowledging it and knowing that it existed and trying to be comfortable with it, I would watch and listen. I would listen back to the interviews over and over. And when I listened back, I realized, actually, when you're just the viewer listening, that only lasts like a second. And also, if after the second you then start talking again, the viewer's listening to what you're saying now, he forgets about that second. It doesn't seem like a big deal to him. So it only seems like a big deal to you. It only paralyzes and cripples you. To the outside guy, he doesn't even know what's going on. Is there any problem? He just maybe thinks like, oh, maybe you just had to take a breath there, or a drink or something, like it's not, he actually doesn't know any of that. So first of all, it's something internal that's happening to you. It's not as that external. And so what I realized was, in that moment, I don't have to think, right, I want to be the guy who can do like 3 hour long interviews. All I have to do is think, right, I've done a minute and a half, I'm out with questions, I don't have anything to say. How about just try and think one more question? There's a deal I'll do myself. When I get into that problem, I'll just stop a second. Remember, a couple of seconds don't matter. I'll just pause a second, collect myself, and I'll just try and think of one more question. If I can think of one more question, I've succeeded, right? I was going to cut it off at 3 questions. Now I've got 4 questions. And what I found is, in doing that, naturally, over time, I could extend the interviews. I could get to these moments, and I could go to 4 or 5 questions, 6 or 7 questions. Sometimes, and I never thought this in it. This wasn't my plan. I would ask the question that was just the one that I was asking to be the 4th one, which might be not that good, it might be generic. And in doing so, that would give me time, the breathing room while he's answering, to think of a really good question, and then I'd ask that, and now I'd be off, and sometimes I'd even find my way back on track in the interview. And what's funny about this is, here's what's so insane about this example. Eventually, it became my style that I became so comfortable in that moment that my entire interview style became to never have a prepared question. I never have any prepared questions when I do interviews. I read, I listen to other interviews with the player, I try and think about the player, and then I'm asking them just in what I'm interested in. I'm accessing my mind and processing what they're saying and coming up with them. So now, 100% of my interviews, questions I'm making upon the moment, I'm making them up according to what he's saying. I'm basically living my entire interviewing life within that moment that was so uncomfortable and crippling and hindering. And now, listen, if you've ever seen any of the Reflections interviews I do, I can do interviews that are 2 hours long. I can make an interview last as long as I want. If the interview's going half an hour and I don't really have more stuff, I could make it last 3 hours, and it would never be a problem for me, never be a problem for him, never be a problem for the audience. They wouldn't know that I was out of questions or I was on problem. I get past those moments and I find my way back. And listen, I don't always have to find my way back to what was before, like how a player's play normally. I can find a different way. I can go a different route. Hey, here's an interesting concept. I haven't thought of this before. Let's see where this goes. And let's be willing to be creative in that moment and just come up with something and hope it works. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Try it. So I was able to do so, and well, I mean, as my career's kind of shown since, a lot of people might naively assume that actually writing's a secondary thing I do, and the video and talking, and people might think, oh, he must be a naturally charismatic person who's just always been self-confident and stuff. No, not really. But I just developed into a place where I acknowledged all these things, I battled my way through them, I found ways to deal with it, ways to become comfortable, ways to express myself despite problems that existed there. And so I thought this was an interesting way to apply a life concept to a game concept. Okay, so I've got a sponsor for this podcast, and it's Vulcan, and they do Fantasy League of Legends. They're also going to do Fantasy CSGO. I don't know if they've started yet, but they're doing it soon. And if you want to play these fantasy games, you go to vulcan.com, and if you sign up using my promo code, which is my name, Thorin with 3 O's, THOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOO then they will match your deposit bonus up to $1,000 by 100%. And yeah, you play Fantasy League of Legends there, soon play Fantasy CSGO. So thanks to them for sponsoring me.